Welcome to Lenten Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, Beryl and Jeremy, thank you for being on with me today. This is a part of our series of Lenten Conversations, and today we're having a conversation again about one of the last things Jesus said, one of the things he said from the cross. And this is one that is quite simple, but it seems to make a huge difference theologically in terms of how we see and understand Jesus' death. Jesus says, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." And then Luke tells us he breathed his last. So let's talk about this. And let's start with that very first word, the way Jesus addresses God. He addresses God in this very familial way, Abba, and that's a Hebrew word which translates father or daddy. We're so accustomed to it that we often forget how radical it was that Jesus addressed God in such an intimate way. Have you ever had a time when someone has startled you or shocked you or made you uncomfortable or pushed the bounds of your comfort zone with the way that they addressed God?
I haven't personally had a friend or anyone close to me refer to God other than God or Father or even the word Abba. And except for, I always think when I hear this, that the movie The Shack was the first time the main character, his wife, referred to God as Papa. And I found that to be at first a little bit jarring. Like I wasn't sure what to do with that. It felt a little too intimate, a little too casual. But yet as it got going, I thought, well, why can't it be that casual when literally God to me, that is the first person I can go to and that I'm safe with always, and that there's comfort and compassion, and I'm never turned away, but yet I'm still so hesitant to really use that term like I would my own earthly dad.
It's interesting you bring up that book, The Shack, because that has a lot of norm bending depictions of God. I remember the first time I heard someone refer to God, as she, and pray to God as Mother God. And that kind of threw me a little at first when you're so used to hearing all the father language. And yet it's very biblical. There's passages in scripture that talk about God nursing us, laboring with the new creation. God like a mother hen or a mother bird kind of sheltering us under God's wings. So we have all this maternal imagery, but I remember being kind of thrown the first time someone said it, and yet also just finding all this deep beauty and comfort in that image too. But yeah, when someone breaks the norms a little bit, it kind of startles us. Beryl, have you had an experience like that?
Probably just now in later years, as I've heard Mother God being used because of my very strict upbringing. That was never used that I recall. Mm-hmm. So, but now it isn't. I mean, once I've been exposed to it and the thinking around it, it doesn't shock me.
And it's hard to remember that that's probably what Jesus was doing to some extent. People were probably pretty shocked to hear him calling God Abba. That was not the way they were accustomed to referring to God, even as they might have used maternal and paternal imagery sometimes for God. God was the Holy One. Well, without getting too hung up on the gendered part of this language, which I know can be problematic for some of us, what new thinking about God do you think Jesus opens up by addressing God as his parent?
I think it's an invitation to see God as a parent figure, more of a kind of that comfort position, where it's not just this heavenly being that is so far removed from us, that there's all this reverence that it's of course it's merited, but that was that personal invitation that Jesus was showing us, that there's a deeper connection, that we can have that relationship with God without anything in between us, just like we would with our parent. As a child, you run to your parents or your whoever is taking care of you, and that is the same relationship that he was emulating. But that's what we do when you run to that parent, and that is God. So I find it very comforting.
I would agree with Jeremy on that, even though there are so many people who haven't had a comforting parent figure.
Yeah, I think it's problematic imagery for some of us, particularly those of us who've had difficult relationships with a parental figure, and at the same time, the love that a parent has for a child might be one of the deeper human loves that we know. And for Jesus to know that most of us know what that, either from being a child or from being a parent, we know what that emotion feels like, and to kind of say that that's a little bit like what that love is that God has for us. I think it helps us to understand, though, of course, we always have to be careful projecting our own images onto God, because God is always so much more than any of that. But those references to things that we know in human life, they do help us to kind of start to tap into what is it to be in relationship with God, to be loved by God.
I wonder and thank you, Beryl, for helping me to remember that, I spoke from my lens, that I do have a very deep relationship with my parents. I'm very privileged and fortunate. And you're right, that is not what so many other people have. And so I wonder what other people who don't have that relationship with an earthly parent, how they hear this language. And I wonder if there is ever an invitation where it would be a risk to see God as that person you can go to, when the person you were supposed to go to here harmed you or pushed you away. And so I wonder if, how other people might hear an invitation to kind of transcend an earthly relationship and to go to another divine parent. I think that might be a big ask, and it definitely is with a lot of risk.
Yeah, I think, what Jesus did was really break the norms, break the bounds, say you can refer to God in intimate language, in language that resonates with you. And I think perhaps we best emulate what Jesus did, not necessarily by praying exactly as he did and calling God Father, but by being willing to always be breaking our own norms about God, and expanding our understanding of who God is, and deepening the intimacy in the way that we relate to God. Well, now, right before Jesus breathes his last, he says this phrase, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Have you ever been with someone in that moment right before death? And if so, what was it like?
And I have been, as I was thinking back on some of the different episodes that have happened to me in my medical life, the one that comes to the forefront is one of my first as a young 26-year-old physician caring for a 58-year-old man and his family. The whole family were patients, and he developed a severe myocardial myopathy, very, very enlarged heart. And this was back in 78.
Mhm.
So we did not have cardiac partial bypass machines then. We didn't do heart transplants. His heart was very close to the end. And I mean, I'd consulted, I felt the best cardiologist, the best pulmonologists. And even though we were using all the drugs we could, there wasn't any hope of him recovering from this. And I found out on sharing this news with him and his family that they had very strong faith. They were Catholic. And within the next days, his blood pressure dropped lower and lower. And on the final day, I went into his ICU room. His wife and his daughter were with him. And he greeted me with, "Hey, Doc, I'll be seeing you." And with that, he slipped into unconsciousness and never spoke another word and died in about an hour from then. And it really had made a big impact on me. "I'll be seeing you. Hey, Doc, I'll be seeing you." And it actually gave his wife and daughter great comfort. They had been with him preceding that, and he had talked with them, and he was at peace with death. So that's the one that is most vivid in my mind, even though it was many years ago.
A few summers ago, when I did my chaplain internship at a hospital, it wasn't uncommon for me to be called to a bedside where the death was going to be imminent within an hour or days or something like that, or the death had already occurred and I was there to comfort the family. But there was one occasion where I happened to be there for the last breath, and there was a large family that gathered around this older woman. It was the matriarch of the family, and the medical staff was there as well, because they said that this was the moments. And I had my hand on the woman, and I asked if anyone wanted to lay hands on her as well. And I began to pray for her. And I don't recall exactly what their faith tradition was, but they were Christian. So I remember praying to God that, the beloved child was going to be coming home, and things like that, the language that echoed what they had asked for. And as I was in the middle of the prayer, I could hear, it was very faint, but I could hear the monitor, the flat line. And I could hear the nurse say to somebody else, because they had to record the time, "She's gone." Literally in the middle of a prayer. I'm assured that the family heard that as well. And I remember it was a very quick pause that I just continued the prayer, but I shifted immediately to thank you. Thank you that you have from our hands to yours, you have taken her. We've, basically we commit your child back to you. And it was the most intimate, powerful, beautiful, privileged moment of my life to be there for that. It's as if this woman invited me to such a moment. I mean, literally her last breath, I got to be there with this family, and I don't take it lightly. And it was so profound. And it was smooth. And the family found a lot of comfort that they weren't by themselves, and they were there for it. They got to witness that.
I've had the privilege of being with a number of our Good Sam members at the end of life, in the last few hours, days, and especially those who still have loved ones who they care for, or particularly that they might feel a responsibility for. I find that there's a lot of the pastoral care in that moment is just giving them permission. let go, giving them permission to leave this earthly life, and assuring them that their loved ones are going to be cared for, and taken care of, and they won't be alone. But yeah, I'm always amazed how much it seems like people have at least um, some bit of kind of choice in that moment where they let go, and how much they really need to decide that. I mean, obviously some people's deaths are more immediate, and but people that, when it's slower, and it really seems like there's a moment when they decide, okay, I'm letting go, this is the end. Well, Jesus uses a certain word in his last prayer. He says, I commit my spirit. Now, sometimes when we're reading the Bible, something gets a little lost in translation because we're not reading the text in its original language. In the Greek, this is the word paratithemai, and it's also been translated alternatively, I entrust, or I commend, or even I set before. In your experience, is this something that normally happens at death, a surrender and an entrusting yourself to something beyond yourself?
That's
I
hard
think,
to answer. Go ahead,
yeah,
Beryl.
I think that it is. And sometimes even people who don't have such a strong faith seem to sense it. And since I've seen a lot of people pass from this life, I was born up and raised in a hellfire and damnation kind of household. That was the church that my family attended, and so I was fearful of seeing or being with people who died. I changed my mind rather quickly when at 16 I went to work in our local nursing home and actually was with several people who died. And it really changed my ideas uh, about dying, that people really, most of the time, I think we're not given a glimpse really of maybe what's on the other side. But most people are able to release or entrust. They kind of realize they're at the end of the line, so to speak.
Beryl, I can really appreciate, and I resonate with you talking about the fear of death. That was a common theme in my family, and I think it still is. It's that we don't talk about death because if we talk about it, we might invite it a little faster. And it's taken me many, many years and decades to shed that feeling. And even as children, we were kept away from funerals and death, and like we were being protected from it. And so I didn't know what to do. And you made it such a great point that it's when I had the opportunity to actually be around death and saw that each person, whatever the circumstance, if I was there relatively or got to hear something about it, there was that moment where it was not as if somebody was giving up hope. That wasn't it at all. It was just this kind of relaxing to be like, okay, this is that surrender of, I don't need to fight this and be fearful. It's as if I don't know if the person had this. I always have this imagery now around death, is that in that kind of haze when somebody, is not as conscious or loses consciousness, then that haziness is where you kind of start to step through that kind of smoky threshold where you can't really get your eyes acclimated, But what you're happening is all of a sudden at that moment of death is where all of a sudden you're acclimated and you can see what's on the other side. And you were like, let's step into that. That's the only way that I can kind of rationalize it for myself. But I do get that sense that I've talked to other people that it seems to be that that moment is just okay.
Yeah, this word, I commit right away, for me, it brings to mind all the memorial services I've ever done. And it's one of the parts of the service in both the Presbyterian tradition and the United Church of Christ. There's always a prayer of committal, or a prayer of commendation, we sometimes call it. But we basically say, into your hands, God, we're giving this person back to you, committing them to you, and kind of say, acknowledge and receive this this child of yours. And it's actually, as I've learned more about other faiths and world religions, it's present in most faith traditions, this idea of committing the person to this larger entity, the divine, and whatever religion it is. We have this practice as human beings of doing that at a death. And it's almost this sense of, we've been borrowing this person for a time, and now they're going back to the source of their being. And it's kind of this beautiful conclusion. I think it brings a lot of closure to a lot of families. Now, when we talk about that committal, oftentimes a chaplain or a pastor or a friend, or maybe if you're in the military, even a fellow soldier, they will pray that prayer for us. Why do you think Jesus prays this prayer for himself? Why do you think someone else doesn't do it for him?
I don't think anyone else was able. He was human, but he was also God. He was who else could have or would have prayed this for him?
Mm-hmm.
That's what do you think, Jeremy?
I was thinking the exact same thing, Beryl, that who around him, and there weren't many people who were advocates for him around. And I think back to his Jewish faith, that I know that there's the prayers of mourning, the Kaddish that is prayed. It is not the same as this exactly. So this was also a departure from the normal prayers of mourning that would have been happening in his culture. And so I think you're right. I don't know if these words exactly, or how this is done, would have been known to do. And I'm wondering if in those times that also a lot of those prayers of the Kaddish were prayed by men. And Mary and Mary Magdalene were there. Like, if they would have felt that they have said some of these prayers, were they allowed to? Not to mention the amount of mourning that they were in. And so I think you're absolutely right that I don't know if anyone would have really known what to do.
I think of all the people who have died alone this year, or for whom we didn't or couldn't have a memorial service the past year. How does Jesus' short prayer from the cross comfort you, comfort us?
I'll be honest, I struggle with that when you talk about not having to be able to gather and have, a funeral isn't just that ritual and ceremony. There's a lot of fellowship and collective mourning and grieving that goes along with that process. So for me, I to be honest, I don't know if that little short prayer really brings me enough comfort, that I feel like I am still wanting more. I don't know. I'd have to unpack why that is. It doesn't feel enough. Even though really it's profound to say, committing back to you. But there's just something that feels it, like we talked about, that it was Jesus kind of advocating for himself, and it was a very intimate moment between he and God, or those people who would be right around to pray. a funeral seems to open that lens up wider to invite more people in. And it feels like I personally would need more time with that.
I know for me, just knowing that Jesus had that experience, and we know there are people around the cross, at least within earshot. In one of the Gospels, he speaks to his mother and his beloved disciple. And yet, really, he, in a lot of ways, died a death alone. And I guess what's comforting to me is to know that Jesus knows what that experience is like. I guess I imagine him by the bedsides of those who did die alone this year, praying this prayer for them, when there was no one else there to do it. Or I think of all of the, I've read so many articles about nurses and things who have been holding the iPads and there with people as they breathe their last breath, who probably, are sitting there thinking, I'm not a chaplain. I don't feel equipped for this. And yet I imagine Jesus empowering them with this prayer. And kind of the fact that he prays it for himself, to me, is kind of, there's no right way or wrong way to do this kind of thing. Well, as I researched this word, commit, I discovered that this word in Greek is also the word Jesus uses in that popular saying, to whom much is given or entrusted or committed, much is expected. And, Jesus really gave himself to the world, and then the world sort of turned on him. And now he's giving himself back to God on the cross. Another truly fascinating detail emerged about this word, commit, paratithomai. It's the same root word that Jesus uses multiple times in the Gospels when he breaks bread, blesses it, and gives it to his doubtful disciples to go and distribute to the hungry crowds. When we read that story of the feeding of the 5,000, this is the word that's used there. Jesus sets the bread before them, commits the bread to them. Jesus entrusts this resource to the disciples, and it's then to be distributed and consumed by the hungry. And it's kind of in the same way that he's now entrusting himself to God, setting himself before God to be distributed and fed essentially to the hungry. And it's one of the odder beliefs if you're not inside of our faith tradition. And it's often one of the most misunderstood and troubling beliefs. Early Christians were called cannibals because of this. But we have this belief that Jesus' body becomes this meal for all who hunger. What does, or what has that belief meant for you? What meaning has it taken on for you over the years?
For me, the first thing I always think of is that, and it took me some years to figure this out, that there's enough Jesus, there's enough God to go around. And that it's not about someone is invited to get a bigger piece than another or more of a relationship, that God was, and Jesus was offering up himself, Jesus himself and God themselves, to nourish us in the ways that to feed our needs, our loneliness, our need for love, our need for someone to unpack and lament with, all kinds of things. But there's enough to go around.
Yeah, Jesus' disciples were, in that feeding of the 5,000 story, they were reluctant to feed the crowd. They didn't think there was going to be enough. And yet Jesus, someone at our recent fast meeting put it, Jesus took a little boy's Happy Meal he was willing to give up and set it before them and said, start passing it around. And it ended up being enough for everyone. And I think it's beautiful that that's the same word that, the same word that's used for Jesus, set the bread before them to pass around. Jesus now saying to God, I set myself before you. And, implied is to pass around to all those who are in need, who are hungry. Beryl, for you, has that belief taken on any meaning in your life?
In my early growing up years, we didn't have regular communion.
Mm-hmm.
We had a love feast once a year.
Wow.
So it's sort of been a slow meaning. It's very meaningful for me now, but to me, it's more symbolic. So I'm still in the process of kind of working this whole idea through, but I very gratefully received the elements.
Well, so Jesus says, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And that's the last thing he says, and breathes his last in one of the Gospels. But then in the Gospel of John, much earlier, before his death, in John chapter 10, he says something very similar. He says, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay my life down in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. That statement, coupled with this, actually on the cross saying, here, into your hands I commit my spirit. Does that mean that we shouldn't talk about Jesus' death as a murder, or say that he was killed? Can the cross be both a murder and a freely given gift? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can be both because I think it is both, but trying to explain it.
I think even about those who are killed by an enemy combatant, or gosh, think about Martin Luther King, for instance. There's people who we talk about as both their life was taken from them, but also their life was given, that there was both choice and having something kind of taken from them. And I think we talk about Jesus in the same way. And to some extent, I think theologians have felt it's necessary to talk about it in those two ways if we're going to say that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, because it's problematic to say that God's life was taken from God, right? And so we kind of have to talk about it as this both and thing.
I completely agree. I mean, that's the complication of a both and.
Mm-hmm.
That before Jesus, the sentence was made. He was going to be killed. And I like the empowerment that he had, the agency of himself to say, I can't get out of this, but I'm taking my power back. And I think that speaks volumes, that I see in communities that are oppressed and marginalized, that there's still a way that sometimes you can't work against a system or can't get out from underneath it, but you can't take my dignity. You can't take who I am as a person away. And I always, when I think of this, I think of Maya Angelou. And when she said that, you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air, I'll rise.
I
She
think
gets the last
that's
say.
I think that's very much what this moment is. And one of the horrifying details of Jesus' death is that he's killed legally. And I don't want to get too deep into who killed Jesus. I think probably the best answer is that we all did, because we all participate in systems of oppression, and we know that legality is about power, not justice. But I imagine hearing that kind of statement from people that have been in the news recently, or in our history, these innocent, unarmed people whose lives are taken, and hearing them make that kind of defiant statement, you don't take my life, I give it. Have you ever known someone who kind of embodies that spirit of what you talked about exactly, Jeremy? That Maya Angelou, you can do all this stuff to me, but I'm still going to rise. Have you ever known anyone like that?
I know quite a few people like that, especially all the work that I've done in the LGBTQ community and the different organizations. I'm in awe of the resiliency of so many people that, under just normal circumstances, is a very heavy load to carry in this world. And that what they make of that. I think of Dennis and Judy Shepard, when their son was killed. Rightfully, they could easily retreat back and mourn. And instead, what they did is they rose and they made sure that they made a difference in this world on behalf of their son, that their son would for sure have a legacy and make a difference in this world.
Yeah, I think of the Parkland shooting victims, and Emma Gonzalez and others who have absolutely risen out of the horror and the ashes of that awful day, and wow, the way that they've looked that right in the eye and said, you're not going to take my life. I'm gonna yeah. I know I've had that experience even going to some of our fast meetings, and I'm often seated at a table with a group of people, and you look around and everyone, I don't know, you have no idea people's stories when you're just sitting
Yes,
next to them. And often in fast, we're asked to share why we care so much about justice, or things that we've experienced. And sometimes I hear the stories of the people next to me, and I know that they are so engaged in this fight for justice with us in fast, and I'm just in awe of what they have pulled through, what they have faced, and the way that they are very much reclaiming power by engaging in justice work. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. Were you